haere mai, and welcome to Cult Chat, the podcast where we talk about coercion, control, and all things cultish. I'm Dr. Caroline Ansley. I'm a medical doctor. As a child, I lived at the Centrepoint community, a notorious cult in New Zealand, and now I run a website that advocates for the former children of the community.
I'm Liz Gregory, and I run the Glory of Our Leavers Support Trust, and I'm privileged to walk alongside people after leaving this group as they embark on their new lives.
And I'm Lindy Jacob. I'm a former member of the Exclusive Brethren, and I'm part of the Olive Leaf Network, a new initiative in Aotearoa to support leavers of high-demand religious groups. Come with us as we unpack the cult playbook. We'll be talking to experts and leavers of coercively controlling groups, and we will call for Kiwis to cult-proof their lives.
Come with us as we traverse the cultiverse.
A warning, this podcast contains references to subjects and discussions which may be difficult for some people to hear. Please take care of yourselves and your whānau when listening.
Okay, welcome back. We're here with Gina, Catena again. This is the second episode of a two-part series, two-part interview with Gina. If you want to really understand today's episode, you should go back and listen to the last episode, which will tell you all about Gina's background, the group she was involved in. We've gotten up to the point in our conversation where she says she's just left, and that's where we're going to regroup and start up again. So hello again, Gina. It's nice to have you back again.
Again, it's such an honor to be part of this with you, Caroline. I can't even express the honor. I'm proud of what you're doing. I'm supportive of what you're doing, and I'm really glad that it can be of some help.
Oh, great.
So
I want to ask you a question before you get started. Yeah.
Oh, sure.
So just to pull back into that last episode, you've just entered this new world, which you're not very familiar with. And you're independent, you're without the group in your life. What was that like? You left a lot behind.
Yeah, so what I was just wanting to move into as we were finishing for the first episode is that for those who've never been in a group, it's very hard to fathom the level of fear about leaving, especially someone who's born and raised in a group. It's not like you moving across town or moving across country, but you still have your old friends who you can reach out to, or you still have your family. It's not like leaving a job, but you still have your church and your family, or leaving your church, but you still have your job and your friends. This is, you lose everything. You lose your spiritual connections. I use that word very loosely, spiritual. You lose your friends, you lose your family, you lose your job. You lose your identity, all at the very same time.
Mm.
And then what? And somebody can be walking around and looking just like you or me, but they have this huge loss. It's much bigger than heartbreak. The loss is enormous. Many people who are born and raised in groups haven't even finished high school. Some don't have birth certificates. To function in the mainstream world without the very basis of basics is absolutely terrifying. So for a medical person who's practicing, talking to somebody, I'll use blood transfusion for a Jehovah's Witness as an example. If it's, I deliver babies. Someone has a massive hemorrhage, loses a couple of liters of blood, we recommend a blood transfusion. If they're Jehovah's Witness and they accept a blood transfusion, they will be rejected from everything they know, from everybody they love. They would rather risk being a walking ghost until their body can rebuild those red blood cells 6, 8, and 9 months out than risk being rejected from all that they know and love. Yeah. That's beside the fact of the spiritual beliefs they have about taking blood. Yeah. It's not just that they lose the spiritual beliefs. They lose their entire family, work,
Yeah.
traditions, everything,
Yeah.
if they accept that blood. So it's so hard for me to explain that to my coworkers,
Yes.
physicians, nurses, when we have somebody who is declining a blood transfusion, declining a vaccine. It's the existential threat is enormous. So leaving the group is really scary. And as I had said before, I didn't want to leave by myself. I knew I would need to have my then husband with me. Then learning to interact in the world. There's a whole way of using phrases, terminology, cult jargon that is not with mainstream use of the same language, even though we still speak English. So if somebody, I refer to a Bible-based group only because Christianity is more, I think most of your audience is more familiar with Christianity.
Yes.
And so there's ways of talking about fellowship, about referring to some verse in the Bible that carries a whole other larger meaning to it.
Yes.
So we had that as well. They were just Hindu terms.
Mm.
And so then how do you interact with the rest of the world?
Because you don't know the language in the same way, and words that might be benign in English actually have deep and potentially quite triggering meaning for someone in your group. Yeah. And you don't even know what common usage might even be.
Having stress was the equivalent of affiliating with Satan.
Right.
Don't want to be stressed.
No.
You need to be stressed. It was one time I started at the community college. I had kids. My first class was chemistry, general chemistry. Very early in chemistry, you took chemistry. On the wall, giant wall in the lecture hall, the periodic table of the elements. And it's being explained to us how this is laid out. The electrons, the number of electrons, the number of orbits of electrons, how their bonds are. And I suddenly understand what this chart means.
Mm.
And I looked up at this wall like this light bulb going off. And I thought, that's God. That makes sense. Like all this other stuff about your spiritual energy and your auras and what vibrations you're putting out and negativity and positivity spiritually was all just a bunch of gobbledygook. This made sense. This is universe in a graph on the wall. And if I can understand this, I can understand how nature really works. That was huge.
Absolutely.
Because for so long I was like people who I loved and respected and saw as elders, were talking about these different spiritual mystical teachings, but none of it really made sense. This made sense. Periodic table of elements. So then I just, of course, kept studying and learning and enjoying the sciences. I switched from doing pre-medical, wanting to go into medical school because I had 3 kids I had to feed. So I couldn't wait 12 years before having an income. I needed to get down and dirty and practical. So becoming a registered nurse, then I could still work as a nurse and continue on for bachelor's degree, master's degree. I picked up a degree in art history along the way because I didn't like nursing school, but I really enjoyed a general ed requirement to humanities and art history. And I ended up getting a degree in that as well. I partially grew up in Italy, which is another exposure to non-cult people. My parents had sent me as a teenager, age 14, to live with some relatives over there. And so no one there was part of the cult. And those were all good people. So that was also something in my psyche that I knew I could leave, that there are other good people out there who haven't ever heard of this guru and his teachings. But still, even with that, I remember I was probably about a year into going to higher education and just feeling there was something wrong inside of me. I couldn't connect to people. I couldn't real human connection. And I knew it was something in me. And I was driving home and I literally slammed on the side of my steering wheel thinking, it's not possible that the whole world is in ignorance and only we have the truth. I knew that that belief was such a core part of me. It was interfering in my being able to see myself as equal with other people. Some part of me still felt I was more special.
So you had to find that and explore it and
yeah,
get rid of it.
but I find it in that moment, which was good. At that time, the C word was not part of my vocabulary. Cult.
Yeah.
We didn't have the internet to get help. I was just trying to survive and pay the bills and keep everybody fed. And I got my kids into all kinds of extracurricular activities that I had not done as a child, from sports to summer camps, that sort of thing. And through that, I befriended other parents, and we developed our own little community, helping out with scouts and baseball and that sort of thing. And gradually developed a community of people through that. And that was wonderful. People who were still in the cult, I had used to send Christmas cards or try to call, and they wouldn't write cards back, and they didn't take my calls. And that was really sad.
Breaking.
You know, and I still love them, and I still do love them.
So I'm wanting to sort of dig into a little bit about your professional work, and the fact that you'd come from a group that forbids medical care and has lots of ideologies around healthcare that you've already mentioned. And I find it really remarkable, I have to say, that you've ended up pursuing a career in medicine, this domain that was so strictly avoided and taught to fear as well, I presume. I'm really interested in the building of not only your career, but that scientific world view around health and how that played itself out in your clinical practice as a...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There were multiple stages of overcoming my fears, inner fears. And I was determined to do it, obviously. So, I mean, the first couple of times we had to do rotations in the hospital, sure, if they took my blood pressure, it would have been through the roof. My heart was racing, like I was walking into the temple of the devil, to walk into a hospital, let alone be somebody using a stethoscope and opening the charts and understanding this. That was huge. But I loved learning. It was so interesting learning about mitochondria, learning about pathophysiology, learning about the immune system. Loved it. Loved learning about that. It was fascinating. So much so that, when I started learning more about the immune system and vaccines, it was a pretty big day when my children who had not been vaccinated, as I had not been, although I went and got all the necessary vaccines that I needed to go through my studies, because of course they require you to be vaccinated to go do rotations with patients. My kids were, I believe, 13, 8, and 3 when I marched them all into a pediatrician's office about a mile from where I'm sitting right now. I got their very first childhood vaccines. That's a huge reverse.
Yeah.
Completely opposite from the background. I mean, I still think it's very important to maintain a healthy lifestyle. That's the basis. Medical intervention and medicinals and surgeries are not your first line of anything. Exercising, having plenty of fiber, plenty of hydration, really important. Then I think now sometimes of another example. This is not just me. I know a number of other SGAs from the group I was raised in. And
second generation adults.
Yes, thank you. Yes, second generation adults. So there was one gal who was living with me for a while she was going to graduate school. She was paying rent, nominal rent. And I was teaching, clinically teaching at a local hospital one day. And this gal, she texts me, this is fast forward, this is more recent time now. We've got the internet, we've got cell phones, etc. And she texts me and she says, Gina, Rin hurt his ankle. I don't know, he was in construction, he fell down or something, and needs to go to the hospital. And he is so afraid. Like, going to the medical world was putting him in an anxiety attack, even though he knows me.
Mm.
And I said, okay, can he drive? And I guess he borrowed someone else's car, so it was an automatic, and he only had to use one leg. I said, okay, have him come down here. You bring him to the hospital where I'm working today. I will meet him in the emergency room.
Mm.
And here I am wearing hospital scrubs and a white lab coat with my name embroidered on it. You know the uniform. And meet him coming in. And he says, oh, Aunt Gina, you're dressed so scary. I said, this was me. This is me now. Run in. I had told the emergency department I had a family member coming in who was really afraid of the medical world. Anyway, so I just went in back with him while he got his x-ray, while he met with the orthopedist, got it all taken care of. And it just, quelled his anxiety to have somebody who could navigate through that, who he knew wasn't evil. And he had left probably 15 years before that incident. But the ingrained fear.
Yeah, well, that's potentially 15 years of avoiding doctors as well.
Yeah. 15 years after he became an adult.
Yes, after, exactly. So there's a lot of obstacles there, aren't there? If you've come out of a group that teaches such anti-healthcare
yes,
idea.
And oftentimes I think the healthcare workers encounter people like that when they're actually in a real physical crisis. Like my old friend who
had the brain tumor.
Cancer had taken over the majority of her skull space. Or this person with a broken bone. And so it's not like they're fully rational anyway. They're having a health crisis, which would be scary or painful for anybody. Then they have the anxiety level above and beyond that. I think the very most important thing we can do is to be kind.
Yes.
And to smile. To avoid coming across that we're thinking, why are you so stupid that you don't want to take these antibiotics?
Yes.
I've had, again, I'm going to refer to labor and delivery or things in my office, female women's healthcare, because that's what I know, what my experience is. But you'll see it in orthopedics, you'll see it in the emergency room, you'll see it in cardiology, neurology. Someone gets an infection in labor. We want to give antibiotics. They don't want antibiotics. And had one father who was negotiating, well, if 12 hours from now, if her temperature hasn't come down below 102, and the doctors, Fahrenheit, the physicians I work with say, Gina, you got to go talk to these people because I can't deal with them anymore. And so I'll just go in and I just have them ask them what they're thinking, why they're thinking that, why are they afraid of the antibiotic, and then explain where we're coming from on it. 80 or 90% of the time, they'll accept the treatment. Not always. This particular case that I'm using, they did accept the antibiotics. They had a healthy baby. They were planning to deliver the baby with them. They were planning to bring the placenta home and eat it or make capsules. And I just very gently said, after the placenta was born, now you wanted to bring the placenta home, right? They said, yes. I said, well, I haven't asked you what your plans are, but, your baby had a bowel movement inside and there was the infection. I wouldn't recommend ingesting meat that's stained with feces and has been infected. And they go, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe plan plant a rose bush over it. Oh, okay. I say, just dig deep so the raccoons don't dig it up.
I've heard lots of stories about people of our generation dealing with their parents, like you are, with beliefs about healthcare that persist as they become negative beliefs, as they persist and they become older and more frail. And the second generation adults of cult first generation recruits having to navigate these awful outcomes for their parents, like watching them dying without pain relief, with excruciating medical neglect, things like gangrenous feet, and you've already described
my
falling
father
brain tumor, and you exactly. So I think there must be a pretty unexamined social psychological burden that second generations of these groups are bearing to have to, and you've just described it too, for health professionals as well, having to watch as treatment is not delivered, good quality treatment that eases suffering and lengthens life and is just so obvious is not given because of these faulty beliefs that are so harmful and never get broken down and rejected. They hold on to them for a long time. And I'm just wondering if you have any tips about ways to, first of all, unpack, bring to the surface these faulty ideas about health, and then to in the healthcare setting to respond to them in a way, like you gave the antibiotic example, respond to them in a way that can move a person who's already left the group. So they've given up the group ideologies, to help them to make better health choices for themselves moving forward.
I think that's a hard one.
It is hard. It's definitely hard.
My parents, I have longevity genes. Even with my father's situation, he didn't die till he was 90. And my mother's 93 and refused COVID vaccines. And she's now, thankfully, I finally got her into assisted living. And she's very frail and still believes that she will think her way into walking again. As did my father right up until the end. So in terms of my own family, I've been an abysmal failure. So I think you're only, for me, it's when someone already has a little window that I can start finding a way in to help them through that, to help them think through it. But if there's somebody who has an absolute wall, where there's not a way in, all you can do is be kind and loving and hope that the next time they come around, whether if they see you again or they see someone else in the medical world in another way, that they might be a little more open. But if we're harsh to them, it's just going to reinforce.
Absolutely.
And then there won't be an opening. Maybe you will be the person who's making that first opening. That's 3 providers down the line can maybe make an inroad with.
And having an understanding of, like you said earlier, Janja Lalich's bounded choice model. When you're so socially and psychologically ingrained into the thinking patterns of the group, and everything you've got is so deeply invested that to make a choice that's contradicts the group's belief systems means that you will lose everything. Having some understanding of the complexity of the decision for that person doesn't look like a complex decision for you. You've got a fever, you're in labor, you should take antibiotics. It's not a complex decision for the clinician, but having some kind of opening in your own brain to kind of go, there might be bits here that I'm not seeing about the context the person's in, the belief system they have that makes this a life-threatening choice. To choose antibiotics might be something that means they lose everything.
It feels life-threatening to them.
Yes, it does.
When I was still young, late teens, a believer of some sort. I had to go have some dental work done, and I wouldn't let them give me anesthesia. You know, and I still remember sitting there with my mouth open, the sound of the drill, and seeing lights in my head, the pain. But I was so convinced that anesthesia
Yeah.
was evil.
Yeah, I've heard people say that before too, that that's going to be like poison going into their body. You know, someone told me once that they were given some anesthetic during dental treatment, and this person was like so like overwhelmed in the moment. You've poisoned me. You've taken away my purity by giving me this. And like that's what they ended up thinking about, a simple, straightforward treatment option. Um,
Yes. So, yeah, it can be very traumatic. So it's important to realize that we as medical people, our mere presence to someone in that mindset is a traumatic experience.
mm,
I gave the example of the other person, who I just helped minimize his trauma just by
yeah, the ankle.
me well being there. And we can't get them to completely reverse everything that they know all at once. I've seen plenty of people who were raised in groups. Their parents worked full time. Again, I'm speaking from the group I came from. Their parents worked full time for the group, didn't make any money, didn't have any social security,
Mm.
don't have any benefits in retirement at all. Now their parents are old, and the kids who were not given a proper grounding to function in the world and eventually left, but are kind of clawing out an existence as young adults and have their own baby, now have to support their parents as well.
Mm.
It's a lot to take on. And yeah, how to have your parents accept medical care. Ooh, I have no answer to that because I totally failed.
Mm.
My parents, when I did the training I did, they were convinced I went to the dark side, and they told me that. I mean, I will not as a clinician, as the adult daughter of my aging mother, speak to her physician and say, look, she's not going to accept anything.
Mm.
I know that, but please let me know, keep me in conversation. And I know it's difficult to interact with her. I had brought her, I mean, she will, and she's more frail, she's a little more receptive to me. She's dependent on me. Took her to a neurologist at some point, trying to evaluate dementia and trying to get the car keys from her. She wasn't safe to drive. And at one point, the neurologist walks in or out of his office behind me, and he leans over and whispers in my ear, good luck, you're really going to need it. Yeah, I have to have a warped sense of humor. I also, to the core of my being, believe in the importance of informed consent.
Mm.
So I will explain, as I did to my father, my late father, as I do to my mother, as I do to my patients. There's this and there's this. This is what this means. Let me answer your questions. Please tell me. Do you want time alone to think about it, to talk with each other? I'll come back in 10 minutes, 20 minutes? Really, they do have the right to make their own decision.
Yeah, exactly. Even if the decision-making powers are so eroded by faulty information and
Yeah.
fear and phobias.
And
And that's the challenge, isn't it? When you know that the basis of the decision at the heart of it is a whole lot of lies. Um,
I mean, to undo all that myself, I didn't do true cult recovery until 15 years after I left the group and my children were grown. I didn't have time to read the books and learn, do the type of psychological education. But I refer to it as psychological chemotherapy. It was so painful to realize that pretty much every precept I had about how the world is constructed from my childhood, all of that was wrong. To replace all of it. And I was in my mid-40s and already had an education and a career that I could then build the rest of my life from that. I would not wish that level of pain on my mother in her 90s right now. She cannot undo the last 60 years. If she wants to live in this reality right now, it's frustrating for me. Yeah. But that's really painful. And especially when you don't have the ability to now create a new life for yourself. When you're 93 and incontinent and can't walk, like to realize you threw away your whole life on lies.
Yes. It makes me think of the phrase in Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth she's talking about all the people she's killed. And she's reconsidering whether she wants to do any more killing. And she says, I've waded this far into this river of blood that it's easier to keep walking to the other side than it is to go back. And, sunk costs and all that. You're right. There's a lot for a 93-year-old to regret and to face.
Yeah. And it takes a couple of years to undo your brain of concerted effort.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So, yeah, for those people who, as you're saying, the second generation adults dealing with their aging parents who are still declining medical care, they'd have to finish their entire exit counseling process to get to where, I think, they would accept that. And that's a huge thing. Like one of the people who was on the fringe of the cult who stayed friends with me for many years. And I was already involved with ICSA, and I would talk with her. And then at a certain point, she would say, okay, that's enough, Gina. I can't go any further with this. I have to stop here. And I said, okay. Sure enough, when she had a breast lump and she found she had cancer, she refused treatment. She was eating wild salmon, avoiding touching the receipts that come out of ATM machines and other digital machines because the chemicals on that paper would do something, I don't know what. She was doing all types of other things. And then, of course, it didn't work. So then she tries to go get chemo, and it was too late. Her daughter is a physician now. I wrote her letter of reference to medical school.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think it's been lovely sharing this time with you today, Gina, and your stories. I think will certainly stay with me, your personal experiences and the people you've known and walked along with in your career and in your life that you've shared these difficult stories about. And I'm sure that the clinicians who've been listening will take some real wisdom from it. I would just like to say thank you so much. And I hope there's been some value in this conversation for you too. And wondering if there's any last things you want to say before we go.
I do. And so I want to apologize if this conversation was too much about stories, because
I know it was great.
I think that they were
Fantastic.
relevant
The
examples.
stories, people need stories, I think. So,
but I'm actually involved in the field of narrative medicine, which is so the work that you are doing with the Pathways program for New Zealand. I'm about to choke up, and I'm not a crier. Having those modules that I saw in draft form for healthcare providers interacting with people who are currently cult members or under some sort of manipulative influence, or people who recently left. That is so important. And I really want to laud you again, but now this is in a very public way. So I hope you put it with the videos that you're posting, for creating that and for making that available. that is a reference worth more than its weight in gold in terms of how to interact with these very fragile, psychologically fragile folks. They're so vulnerable. And you did a beautiful, beautiful job with that,
Oh,
with those modules.
thank
So
you, Gina.
thank you. And refer people back to
I
those
will. We'll talk more about this.
more than this
Yeah,
conversation.
we will. We'll mention it now, wrap up. But it's time to go. And yes, I very much appreciate your respect from about that. And thank you very much. So thank you, Gina.
Thank you. It's
Okay.
an honor. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. All right, it's great to be back with you too. And I'm wondering what you thought of the second half of my interview with Gina.
Oh, amazing quote. She said, to function in the mainstream world without the basics is terrifying, and the existential threat is enormous. That really jumped out. She was talking and reflecting on the leaving experience. And it's within that context, the existential threat is so enormous. The idea that you've taken indoctrination with you, you're carrying it through into this new world, and now you come up against new situations like a healthcare situation. And there's this massive threat about what might happen if you break a rule from the community that you've believed inside your group around healthcare. So there's this, not only is this anxiety and fear about maybe some healthcare, there's actually this extra level that former cult members suffer from.
Yeah, that existential threat language was really, really interesting because, yeah, I mean, I could identify with it, but again, she was pointing out that, yeah, when people have left a cult-like group, but they still might carry some of those beliefs or values, that some of the things they encounter in ordinary life that might be totally normal for other people, you know, in my case, it was like things like being invited to the movies and being like, but I could go to hell if I go to the movies.
Mm.
Or yeah, other similar things when this panic arises in you because your group has attached existential threat to doing that thing. And so yeah, she was using some examples around yeah, the health impacts, you know, something like taking a blood transfusion, that it's not for those people, it is not just a case of a blood transfusion or a medical procedure. It is intimately linked, you know, back again as we discussed in the last episode to those concepts of tamas or darkness and contamination or evil versus being pure and saved and enlightened, that this medical procedure or medication is going to cause you to be in darkness and away from the light. Like that is an existential panic that could be arising and you know the client sitting there in the doctor's office.
So it's the obstacle. She talks about that obstacle and that fear of healthcare. And I've seen it in the work we do with former Glorival members. You know, in there was definitely a health neglect, serious health neglect. But then people self-impose it on themselves and then they carry it with them. And it's a really, really hard one to knock on the head. But we're just delighted. We've seen some people leaving recently who, after several years, are now having operations for things that they
Wow.
should have received healthcare for like 17 years ago. I'm talking serious body things that happen, broken backs, all sorts, now being remedied. But I find a great sadness that it never needed to get to that. They didn't need to suffer all these years in pain. It was so
And like Gina describes with their father, you know, like untreated rheumatoid arthritis destroys joints. You know, like, there's no going backwards. There's no surgery that can later come along and make up for the health neglect that occurred in the case of her father. It's lost. You know, like that function is gone, and the replacement for the function is a belief in something that's ultimately a lie. You know, so it's the calculation, at least in my view, is not a great one. And that's I really appreciated her reflection at the end where she was talking about her mother and trying to kind of say, well, you know, when you've lived this life and you've believed these things, how do you go back on that and how do you know, there's so much to regret and there's so much that you've given over to this belief and it's cost you so much.
the sunk cost. you mentioned the word sunk cost. It's huge, isn't it?
Your
Yeah.
lovely little Lady Macbeth quote there. You must have studied Shakespeare at high school.
Oh, well, I did. And I really hope that I quote that one a lot. I hope I've got it
Memorized it. I
right.
was quite impressed. Something
Yeah.
that struck me is that you have different doctrinal beliefs for different groups, depending on what kind of control they were trying to have over people. And in the form of sort of the Gloria Vale sphere, they actually have a doctrine that suffering is good. So it's evidence of your faith. And so for them, they think that having that pain in the rheumatoid arthritis is actually evidence that they are right and that they're Christians because they're suffering. Whereas other groups have a view and belief that a hyper faith belief that they should never get sickness, never have difficulty. And so then I don't know how that works out when they get old and they do get ill and they die. Like, how does that work in their heads that they didn't have faith to heal themselves? It's all a bit complex and confusing.
I don't think she didn't talk about the faith. Well, she did talk about her parents having a faith to heal themselves, but
Yes.
it was more this idea that it's past impurity that has led to this. And so ultimately you're responsible for it. There was one comment that she made about her mother and saying that or maybe it was in the other episode, this idea of her having done so well and how her mother was proud in some ways that she grew herself up, and her brother, they grew themselves up. And it made me kind of think of, well, isn't that ironic? When you have got your rheumatoid arthritis and you're suffering, it's because of your failure to achieve enlightenment, and
Yes.
it's your fault. But when you've done well and you've achieved well in the faith, it's not your hard work and your all the struggle you've been through to come out of it in one piece. It's actually the group's ideology. This idea that if you do well, it's because of them, and if you do badly, it's because of you. And I've seen that in many groups, this idea of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, really.
That's the whole part of the confusion of these groups. I've been really examining the doctrines and beliefs, and there's so much conflict and confusion in them, but you're so tired and exhausted. I don't think people have the critical thinking capacity to go through and rationalize it and make sense of it. You just believe the doctrine.
Yeah, and it's the cognitive dissonance thing again, right? And it's the fact that our brains really want to try and make meaning out of whatever our circumstances are. And so, yeah, whether it's suffering or health, we, grab the frameworks, the belief system that we've got, and we find things to, help make it fit. I was really fascinated by the, this idea of education versus miseducation, I guess you could call it. And the whole area of education and information comes up a lot in these groups. By the way, incredible shout out to an incredible book called Educated by Cara Westover. If you haven't read it. It's so fascinating, and it talks about a lot of these themes because she grew up in a anti-establishment family. But yeah, in education, she was denied an education that got her out. And so, there is the kind of temptation there, I think, for many of us or for many people to say, oh, education is the answer. And, for Gina, education was the answer too. She described about seeing the periodic table and saying, this is God. Like, she was so excited that for her, she was like, this is something that makes sense. This is something I can trust. This to me is God. And just that, for her, this thing of finding something concrete and tangible, some science to, be her truth, really, or be a source of truth, was so important to her. And that then helped her to reassess some of her other beliefs around health. But it's still not a silver bullet, because what one person's idea of education is, or one person's idea of information, is different from someone else's idea of education and information. Like, just to take it to a really sticky subject like COVID vaccines, have got really, really different concepts of what is the truth about COVID vaccines and what is information and what is disinformation. And people can land in really different places depending on the education or the information that they access.
The difference is a cultic group tells you the narrative and there's an expectation you'll believe it, and you don't have the ability to challenge and think and dialogue and make a decision that you comfortably own. Cult groups do all that for you, and so they push away your ability to make the connections. And she said something really interesting. It takes a couple of years to undo your brain, and it's a concerted effort. And something I've been reading recently is it's around they say not to really encourage people who've left cults to necessarily go into tertiary study for a couple of years, because they say there's a thing called neural freeze, and it takes a couple of years to thaw out your brain. But that makes sense when you think of what happens when someone leaves. The mind really is quite in a state of mess and chaos, and it's really hard to take on new information and to process properly. So yeah, she just reiterated that. So you can, yeah.
Yeah, and I liked how she came back to it a few times, this period after leaving and what is going on in a person's brain, like that example of the friend or the family member of hers who broke his ankle, and even 15 years later, he still found the hospital, the temple of, what was it? The temple of the devil. I like that. The temple of the devil is the hospital. Like this. And I think that's something that I'd really like to reinforce to healthcare providers, how important it is to kind of get a sense of some of the ideologies of a group that a person has come from, because she talked about what was it? Psychological chemotherapy.
Yes.
But not everyone does it. Not everyone actually takes the chemotherapy that they need to rid their brain of these ideas that are kind of cancerous, really. And I guess that was her analogy. And so some people are out of the group, but still very much in the cult mindset or believing the ideologies of the group. And I just love how she framed to care for people, that you might not be able to get in there into the
might be a wall, not a
it might be
window.
exactly, there may not be a crack, but you might be able to, just through kindness,
Yes.
help the person feel safe at least. And so how critical safety is if you're trying to provide some healthcare to a person who needs it, who's refusing it. Safety is critical. If they don't feel safe, and if they feel like they've been treated with unkindness or callousness or judgment, you'll never see them again. And
to ask the question, what are you thinking? What are your concerns? Can I help explain it from this perspective? And then allowing the person the dignity to actually still make a choice. It's very powerful.
Yeah.
Without judgment and criticism, because that's what groups thrive on. That's how groups operate. Cultic groups. It's always about judgment and criticism. And I know that people have left Gloriavale feel very much like when they go into the doctors, they're going to be criticized about decisions that they've made, and they don't feel confident in standing up and articulating why they're still holding to these beliefs. So they need that very soft and the respect that they're allowed to make this decision.
Absolutely.
But,
and the reason I interviewed Gina is not just because she's a lovely lady and she's got some great stories, is because she shares my passion for communicating with healthcare workers and with patients in a way that bridges some of the huge barriers that have been put into the person by the group, and that have been kind of collaborated with by society, with all the stigma that goes with what people face when they start to talk about their occult experiences. And I'm rather hoping that the pathways that she alluded to will be live when this episode goes live. I think they will. So she talked about the pathways.
Can you tell us about this pathway, Kez? What are you talking about?
What am I talking about? Yeah. Well, in short, doctors in New Zealand all have access to a behind a paywall, behind a password, series of guidances that they can use in day-to-day practice with their patient. Patient comes into the room, maybe they need some advice from the hospital. What do we do next? Or they can't quite remember the medication for this particular condition. Whatever it is, whatever they need to know how we do things here, instead of making a phone call and sending a referral off. And that's all across New Zealand. And I've written a series of pathways, 3 of them, and you 2 have read them, as has Gina, about how to interact with people who are inside cults or having left cults, and how to do that in a caring, kind, cult informed, as I put it, way that doesn't sort of chase them off or make them feel stigmatized or judged, or as quite a few people have said to me, their doctors have looked at them like they've got a blank face, like, hey, you were in a cult? What? Like no idea at all. So I'm hoping to change that through the publication of these pathways. So I think I worked out there's about 5,000 or 5,500 New Zealand doctors in New Zealand, and around about 1,000 practices across, general practitioners, sorry, 5,500 general practitioners, about 1,000 practices around New Zealand, and I'm pretty close to getting these live to most of them.
Amazing, Kaz. I'm so delighted about this, Kaz. It's a huge achievement. And I know that we'd spent quite a bit of time writing a health psychology paper that we would give to doctors and other healthcare professionals to help them understand former Gloriavale members and some of the barriers and obstacles to them receiving care, the beliefs and doctrines that they may be still coming in with. And so just to see that work well expanded, you're in that professional area, have such huge scope here. There's such a scope. You've got international contacts.
There are. Like I said, it should be live in New Zealand now, I'm hoping, and most of the country. And sometimes I joke, next step going to take over the world. But actually it's all over Australia. And that is my next step, is to go to the heads of all the different Health Pathways is the name of the platform, teams, and say, look, guys, you've got lots of cults in your region. Why don't you think about picking this up? I've done all the work for you. So it's not a big stretch, to be honest. And it's also in England and Wales as well. So, like this, I'm struggling to see it. To me, it's just so exciting, like the thought that your doctor is ready with what you need them to know as they walk through the door. And we can expect that your doctor knows something about asthma or blood pressure or diabetes or ankle sprains. But unfortunately, the healthcare profession has kind of dropped the ball on this one. And this is about lifting the game. And the thing is, doctors care about their patients. That's what I keep on telling people. They really, really care. They're in the game because they're caring and compassionate people. But if they just don't have the information, it's harder to care. So this is about lifting it up and going, this really matters. And I hope that my interview with Gina highlighted how in some particular groups, and many actually, there's really targeted focus on healthcare. And we can't just ignore it. It's not like it's irrelevant. The cult experience is not irrelevant to someone's health. It's critical.
Say that again. That's a really important line.
That people's health, being in a cult is highly relevant to people's healthcare. It's not irrelevant.
Huge amounts of health neglect. Illnesses that were never attended to, that should have been the positive things we need to live and keep healthy, like a certain number of hours sleep a night and diets. These things are often missing. Working ourselves to the bone, so thinking patterns around rest and recuperation, and then injuries that weren't dealt with properly. Look, these actually have a huge impact for people years after leaving and exiting, and it's actually quite heartbreaking. I find the physical ailments and illnesses from former Gloriavale members, they're quite devastating stories. And it comes down to birthing stories and near-death experiences of children and mothers. It's shocking, and people carry huge amounts of guilt around that. And then there's just the mental health distress.
And the suicides, all of the suicides. That's what Gina was telling us. These people dying in waves. Janja Lalich's work that she did in the Escaping Utopia book, she described, 6 times the suicidal ideation rate and 10 times the suicide attempts in the groups. Like, that is just what?
And I believe those stats. I have anecdotal evidence that stacks up about right. Devastating.
Yeah. So, yep, this is exciting times for me. So, and exciting times.
Well done, and thanks for including us in that process of being able to look over and contribute in a wee small way and encourage you.
Incredible work, Kaz. It's so exciting, and I just wish I could go back and tell teenage me sitting in a doctor's office and stumbling and stammering over my words, and with a person in authority over me sitting in the room with me from my group. I just wish I could go back and rewrite that experience. Doctor who had your health pathways at their fingertips, that would have made a difference to me, I'm sure. So it's really exciting that for all the future people, there's hopefully a bit more awareness at hand. Amazing work.
Well, I think it's time for us to sign off, and it's been a great little kōrero today. We would like to thank Plains FM for hosting us. We would like to thank you, the audience, for listening and following us. Encourage you to go to our Facebook page and like that, follow it. Also encourage you, if you're not listening on Plains FM, to listen on the Apple or Spotify sites. Also, if you want to get hold of us and tell us how brilliant we are, ideally, you can email us on info@cultchat.org.nz. So until next time, I'd like to say ka kite anō.
Bye, everyone.
See you later.
If anything in today's episode was difficult or upsetting for you and you would like to talk to somebody, we encourage our New Zealand listeners to free call or text 1737 for support from a trained counsellor. Or you might like to visit the resources section of the Olive Leaf Network website, where you can find a range of organisations and resources that might be able to support you. We would also like to remind you that the views and thoughts and opinions that have been expressed in this program are the speakers alone, and Cult Chat does not necessarily endorse or share them.